it, Sue.
I'm glad
So
you
everyone
presented.
should have the slides up in front of them. So
Yes.
our challenge is we've got about what we hope will be about 45 minutes to somehow cram a 3-month cruise into that period of time. We do want to leave enough time at the end for questions that you might have about some of either our experiences or what a trip of that length in a not overly spacious cabin is like. So to start out, wanted to give you an idea of where we went. And so we started in French Polynesia, in Tahiti, to be exact. And so everything over on the right-hand side of this map, there's kind of a lump of places all close together. And that's French Polynesia, where we started. We actually spent the first 10 or 12 days just cruising around in French Polynesia. From there, we started to head west across the Pacific, going to Samoa, and we also went to, excuse me, Fiji. From there, south to New Zealand, we had 5 stops in New Zealand, followed by 5 stops in Australia. We were also in Papua New Guinea. We had 4 stops in Indonesia. From Indonesia, we went to Singapore. We were then in Malaysia, 3 stops. And Thailand, we had 1 stop in Thailand, then across to Sri Lanka, and then to India, and then across the Indian Ocean to the Maldives. And a lot of the names you see here are actually the cities that were the stops. So Phuket, for example, was Thailand. Hambantota was one of our Sri Lanka stops, as was Colombo. Our stop in India was Cochin. The capital of the Maldives is Malé. The island we stopped at in the Seychelles is Mahé. This gets confusing enough for you. In the Comoro Islands, we were in Mayotte. Then we were in the capital of Mozambique, Maputo, and we ended the trip with 3 stops in South Africa, ending up in Cape Town. So we started in the middle of February, and we ended up in Cape Town in the middle of May. So I'll turn it over to Jan.
Thanks, Gary. As Gary said, our cruise adventure began with a 10-day circuit in French Polynesia. The 120 islands of this French overseas collectivity are sprinkled sparsely across the South Pacific and are divided into 5 archipelagos, or 5 groups of islands. Only 75 of the islands are inhabited. We visited 7 of them, a few more than once, starting with Tahiti. These tropical islands are the result of volcanic eruptions. The new, now think, when I say new, think about 1 million years old. The new high islands like Tahiti and Nukuhiva are hilly, mountainous, tree-covered, and often have lovely waterfalls. All that remain of the older islands, so more than 1 million years old, are circular coral reefs, or atolls, A-T-O-L-L-S, that enclose a lagoon and that originally formed around the tops of the volcanoes. The coral reefs have remained, but the volcanoes themselves have sunk into the sea. Apparently, the reefs look like a pearl necklace from the sky. These islands are indescribably beautiful. The coconut trees, lush green vegetation on the high islands, abundant flowering plants, clear aquamarine water, as you see here in Rangiroa, and white or sometimes black sand beaches truly make for a tropical paradise. What I loved was the snorkeling, a true highlight of our trip for me. both in French Polynesia and at the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It was like entering a magical other world. Warm, crystal clear, turquoise waters filled with intricately shaped coral formations, which attracted numerous schools of brightly colored fish. And they too had their own individual markings, interesting markings. Unfortunately, most of the coral has lost its color. Much of the coral has lost its color, I should say, although efforts are being made to rejuvenate it. But there were certainly still many pops of deep, vibrant hues to catch my eye. Several of these islands boast overwater bungalows, which you see here in Moorea. They're frightfully expensive, but a reason to return, as far as I'm concerned. Hey, Gary. We visited the islands in a variety of ways, walking along the coral atolls on our own to explore or stop at a deserted beach area to snorkel, as in Fakarava. Here in Raiatea, I took a boat trip out to an oyster farm in the lagoon to learn how black pearls, which you see here, a major export of these islands, were produced and harvested. I also did some snorkeling off the oyster platform there. Other options were to hire a taxi to take us to a beach or see particular sites. And sometimes we signed up for an excursion around an island arranged by the ship, as we did here in Bora Bora.
So after French Polynesia, it was west to Samoa, and we were in the main port in Samoa. And the highlight there, in a lot of ways, and many people associate Samoa with Robert Louis Stevenson, the novelist from 2 centuries ago at this point, 1.5 certainly. And this is his villa that you can see here that he had built. The reason he moved to Samoa was for health reasons. He had a very weak system, and ultimately he needed warmer weather. Gosh, we're better than Samoa. And his fragile health did in fact improve when he moved to Samoa. The other thing that happened in Samoa, and I should say it probably happened in at least a dozen different places that we visited, was a group welcoming us at the port. So whether it was folkloric dancers or musicians, singers, in this case, it's a choral group in Samoa welcoming us to the country. It was always an interesting juxtaposition. It was usually a grotty port where we were pulling up, and you had all these colorful dancers. Even when we landed in Tahiti at the airport, we were greeted by performers there as well. So this was a pretty common thing. Unfortunately, in a sense, when we were in Fiji, again, it's a tropical paradise, but our one stop in Fiji was Suva. That's the capital. And so it was a very urban area. But it was fascinating walking around in town. And one of the places we stopped at was at the municipal market. It's huge. Apparently, when it's at capacity, there are about 3,500 vendors at this particular market. So they even come in from some of the other islands. We also saw, of course, the government buildings, the cathedral, and other things you'd expect to see in a capital city. From there, we moved on to New Zealand.
Each of our ports offered interesting and often quite varied adventures. I had thought that it couldn't get any better than French Polynesia until we arrived at Bay of Islands, our first of 4 ports in New Zealand, and kayaked the Waitangi River to Harura Falls. Along the way, we paddled through mangrove forests that lined the shore, a first for both of us. In Gisborne, New Zealand, the first city in the world to see the sunrise each day, we had crossed the international dateline before arriving here. And to welcome the new year, we biked around town with 13 other cyclists. Our guide shared stories of the original Maori settlers, their culture and legends, and led us to this monument marking Captain Cook's landing in Gisborne in 1769. The Te Papa Museum in Wellington intrigued us with this display of a Maori waka, W-A-K-A, waka, or canoe, that held up to 30 people and was used for warfare, transport, or fishing. There was also an extremely informative and quite powerful and moving exhibit about Gallipoli, New Zealand's equivalent of Canada's Vimy Ridge. This slide should probably be entitled Rockin' and Rollin' on the Tasman Sea. Generally, our cruise was very smooth sailing. However, the Tasman is notoriously rough, and it lived up to its name. Seasickness drugs were handed out at reception, evening performances were canceled, and we missed 2 ports. We were in sight of the dock at Burnie, Tasmania, when the harbor captain decided it wasn't safe for us to dock. So we had to bypass Burnie. And unfortunately, our next port, actually our first stop in Australia, wasn't equipped to handle immigration facilities for us. So we had to skip that one too.
So instead of 7 stops in Australia, we had 5 stops in Australia. But the first one was pretty magnificent. And this, of course, is Sydney. You can see the Opera House in the background. This is a remarkably vibrant city, and I'm sure a lot of you have been to Sydney. What was particularly surprising to us, and this was based on our first night out, but we experienced it also on the subsequent day or two. All of the patios, outdoor restaurants, and so on were just jammed. And it didn't matter what time of day it was. It left us wondering whether or not anybody works in Sydney because of all the people that we saw. We also did have an opportunity to tour the Sydney Opera House, which is quite an impressive facility inside as well as outside. I'll just tell you a bit about a couple of our other stops in Australia. One of them was Newcastle, and our day in Newcastle, and everybody associates Newcastle, of course, with England. I'd never even heard of Newcastle, Australia, but it was kind of a really fun and interesting day for us. It's quite beautiful, and one of the centerpieces on the coast there is Fort Scratchley, which was actually torpedoed by the Germans in the Second World War. We don't usually associate German activity in the Southern Hemisphere to that extent. But when we were at Fort Scratchley, one of the rangers latched onto us. And I didn't write his name down, Jan.
Norman?
Norm. It was Norm, of course. Norm. So Norm tagged along with us around the site. Norm is 96.
Wow.
He retired years ago as a ranger, but that doesn't stop him from showing up every day in uniform and helping out wherever he's needed. He was a riot. He just had the greatest stories, and he was great with kids who were on the site. So he was a lot of fun to be with. From there, we went to the cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in Newcastle. Good timing for us because the rehearsal was going on for the Palm Sunday service at the time. And there was an orchestra with an incredible trumpet player, a large choir, and so on. Later in the day, in the afternoon, we went to the museum. We were able to get tickets to see an organ recital on an old historical organ. Well, it turns out that the fellow who was playing violin along with the organist, let me just get that picture up here, was the same fellow who was conducting the rehearsal at the cathedral earlier in the day. And so since he does a lot of choral music and so on, Jan leaned over to me and said, "You should ask if he's familiar with Eleanor Daly's music." And I'm thinking, Jan, don't embarrass yourself. Don't ask him that.
I wrote that question down.
And so, sure enough, she asked him. His eyes lit up. "Eleanor Daly? You know Eleanor Daly?" He said, "In fact, at our Maundy Thursday service, we're doing one of her pieces. And the choir will be practicing it later today. You should come back and hear that." We would have if we didn't have a ship sailing at 4 p.m. that day. So it didn't happen. But he insisted on having his picture taken with us, and Jan then sent that on to Eleanor. So it was quite a fun day in Newcastle.
Wow.
From there, we continued north up to the Great Barrier Reef area and Cairns. Jan did some snorkeling at the Great Barrier Reef. I passed on it, partly because I had snorkeled the Great Barrier Reef back in the mid-1980s, and I kind of wanted to remember it in its sort of full Technicolor version, which I suspect it's not quite so much anymore. We were also in Darwin, Australia, and you can see Jan here with not a kangaroo, but a smaller version of kangaroos known as wallabies. And this was at a territory wildlife reserve outside of Darwin. So that was our visit to various ports, one or two, which I left out, but some of them in Australia.
Papua New Guinea is not your typical tourist destination. Unrest in the highlands and a lack of infrastructure are probable reasons for this. However, we enjoyed a great, if somewhat challenging, 2-kilometer trek up a muddy, root-strewn path in Verarada National Park to a magnificent view overlooking the Coral Sea. You can see that kind of in the background below the clouds there. The litter and numerous rickety food stalls, thank you, all selling the same few items that lined the highway on the way to and from the park, spoke of deep poverty. But the throngs of people, and you only see a few here, but they were just crowds of people all along the highway, including children who were out of school for Good Friday, who waved enthusiastically and called hello as our bus drove past, spoke also of joy and resilience.
From Papua New Guinea, we were off to Indonesia, and our first stop there was Komodo, Komodo Island. And most of Komodo Island is actually a national park. And we actually did a private tour here. Instead of doing the ship's tour, there was a couple on board who I think practically live on cruise ships. This was their third visit to Komodo Island in the past 2 years.
Oh.
And because they've been there a number of times, they had sort of latched on to a local tour operator who not only offered a visit to the Komodo National Park central area, but also we could take some time to relax on a beach with pink sand. And that's caused mostly by red coral that is nearby, that it gives a pinkish tinge to that particular beach. You can see a small Komodo dragon here in front of a likeness of him on the sign. They are very impressive lizards. They're the biggest in the world. They can weigh hundreds of pounds. What was interesting too, and you can see this on the right, is there were guards that went with us through the park to protect us from the Komodo dragons should they decide to attack for any reason. I can't say it was overly comforting to see that the way they stop the Komodo dragons is with these wooden staves with a little forked part on the top. I guess they sort of catch it by the neck and push it backwards. They do get excited, the Komodo dragons, if they scent blood. So following their advice, I didn't even shave that day because I didn't want to nick my face and have a bit of blood on my face. So I was good. Ironically, I actually did nick my face the next day, first time on the whole trip. But so it was good to have that advice ahead of time. We were also in Bali for a couple of days, and you can see us here at one of numerous temples, actually, that we did visit when we were in Bali. This is called the Pura Pusay Temple in Batuan on the island of Bali. Bali also has plenty of traffic. We were even an hour late getting back to the ship. It's a good thing it was staying for a second day, trying to get through all of the traffic. Another visit in Bali was actually to the Sacred Monkey Forest Sanctuary. And you can see Jan here. Jan's the one on the left. But very friendly monkeys. These monkeys are actually called macaques, long-tailed macaques. That's the name of this particular kind of monkey. Because it's a religious shrine area as well, the monkeys are protected. On the island of Java, our port of stop was Samarang, and our stop there required a bus trip to the south end of the island, but so worth it. This is Borobudur. Borobudur is the largest single temple structure in the world. It was mostly buried and largely forgotten for centuries, and in the last century or two has been excavated and large parts of it restored. But you can see the size of this complex by the people in the foreground. And it took quite a long time on different levels to actually see and appreciate the whole temple.
On to Singapore. I was enchanted with Singapore, another place I'd happily return. It's a vibrant city filled with towering skyscrapers, colorful Hindu temples, bustling ethnic areas, ubiquitous hawker stalls selling delicious and inexpensive meals, beautiful botanical gardens, a lush canopy of green. It is immaculately clean. There are signs in the subway stations, even at the hawker stalls, saying there would be a fine if you didn't clear your table. But the signs in the subway stations indicated there was a serious fine for spitting, smoking, chewing gum, or littering. And clearly those signs are effective because, as I said, the city was spotlessly clean. Now, I headed out that day on my own. That was the only day in our whole trip where one of us wasn't feeling great. Gary wasn't up to par, so he thought it best to stay on the ship. So I headed out on my own with some trepidation, this huge city. I managed to navigate the subway system, which mammoth stations, which were very well signed. I wandered through Chinatown, which was fascinating, just a busy, bustling, full of smells and sights and people part of town. And I gradually made my way to Raffles Hotel, where I had, of course, the requisite Singapore sling. I just settled in at the long bar here on my own when friends of ours, an American couple from the ship, arrived and invited me to join them at their table. So I did, and we had a nice chat over our drinks. And as they were leaving, they said, well, come along with us. So the three of us headed to Gardens by the Bay, again, another subway ride. And we were, it was nighttime by that time. We were absolutely mesmerized by the sound and light show at the solar powered Super Tree Grove in Gardens by the Bay, which is located on the 25% of Singapore that's built on reclaimed land.
So our next country was Malaysia. We had 3 stops in Malaysia. The first was the port outside of Kuala Lumpur, and we had a fascinating trip of Kuala Lumpur. We also visited the island of Penang and its city, Georgetown. But our third stop was on the island of Langkawi. And Langkawi, in addition to, of course, beautiful beaches, is also the site of the Machinchang Cambrian Geoforest Park. And you have to take a cable car up into the hills to get there, and to particularly get to the Sky Bridge. This is an amazing lookout. This bridge suspended from one pole, way up in the hills in the highlands with beautiful views of the rest of the coast of Malaysia.
Our 2-day stop in Thailand was at Phuket, a large island, in fact, the largest in Thailand, at the southern end of the mainland. At Phang Nga Bay, we boarded colorful, motorized, long-tail boats. Traveling past mangrove jungles, we were treated to spectacular views of tree-covered limestone karsts jutting out of the water. You see this big block of stone? It's called a karst. A tectonic plate collision over 300 million years ago created over 80 of these uniquely shaped islands. And the locals have given them appropriate names: Elephant Island, Puppy Dog Island, and so on. Well, the most well-known is James Bond Island, the one you see here, where Roger Moore filmed a scene from The Man with the Golden Gun. The following day, we joined 2 of our shipboard friends from Britain and hired a driver to see other highlights of the island, including this 45-meter-tall Big Buddha statue. The view from the top over the Andaman Sea was well worth climbing up all those steps in our bare feet. You can see people's shoes lining the railings there, the edge of the stairs.
So we sailed across the Andaman Sea and ended up in Sri Lanka. The port has really nothing to offer. The port was built by the Chinese. I'll talk more about that a little later, but it's one of their many Belt and Road initiatives of providing infrastructure funding to third world countries, basically. But from Hanban-Toda, with another group of friends we met from Florida, we went out to Yala National Park, and with safari vehicles, went through the park. In addition to elephants, we saw at this particular park water buffalo, monitors, wild boars, and even way off in the distance, a leopard. It's not the same kind of big game that you would find in Africa, but still pretty darn impressive. Our other stop in Sri Lanka was the capital city, Colombo.
Our excursion to an island off the coast of Kochi gave us some insight into India's past. The shore was lined with these Chinese fishing nets, massive nets capable of being lowered and raised by one person using a cantilevered bamboo mechanism. Incoming tide brings fish into the net, which is then raised and emptied. Raising and lowering the net many times throughout the day provides fish or income for a family. The fishing village we visited on the island was set up with centers It reminded me of my kindergarten classroom, actually, which showcased the numerous ways the coconut palm tree, the lifeblood of the village, was used to sustain life in the village. Nothing was wasted.
So the Maldive Islands were quite interesting. You can see here off in the distance the main island and the capital city of Malé. What is remarkable to me is that entire island is entirely built up. It's all urban, including a few high rises, and yet that island is never more than 1 meter above sea level. And you can see why then the Maldives is one of the most threatened countries in the world in terms of global warming and rising ocean levels. In fact, as a publicity stunt a while back, the Maldive cabinet actually donned scuba equipment and held one of their cabinet meetings underwater and filmed it and made it available to the rest of the world, just to give everybody a sense of what we might be looking at in the future. On this particular visit, we did take a ferry across to a smaller island, and this is where we spent some time on a beach looking back at the main part of the Maldives. If you look off to the right, you will see some pylons and other things in the water. That's a bridge that is now under construction by the Chinese. When this project finishes, 5 islands in the Maldives will be joined by this mammoth bridge that's being constructed. Of course, the downside to this is this is not Chinese largesse. These are loans, and it puts many of these nations in debt to China. And so much like the Hambantota port that we saw in Sri Lanka, this is another Chinese project. We saw them in the Seychelles. We saw them in Mozambique. They're going on in a lot of places.
The capital, called Mahé, somewhat confusing because of Malé in the Maldives. The capital of the largest island in the Seychelles was charmingly quiet as we visited on a Sunday, where everything in town was closed in this predominantly Catholic country, even the normally bustling local market. We did get to see the colony of giant tortoises at the Botanical Garden, and the following day, I snorkeled off a catamaran. Even though the current was strong, the water cloudy, and neither the coral nor the fish as plentiful or as colorful as in French Polynesia, the water and the air temperature were a balmy 28 degrees, and I was snorkeling in the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, 1,000 kilometers off the coast of East Africa. A pretty special experience.
Mayotte is part of the Comoro Islands. However, it is not part of the Comoros nation. The people on this one lone island in the Comoros at the time of independence, which was 1975 for the Comoros, the people on Mayotte decided no, they did not want to join. They wanted to remain French. And so Mayotte is a French department, and they vote in French elections. When we were in Mayotte, a fairly small area, we did do a fairly steep climb to get up into the hills to see this green crater lake, which is called Lake Ziani. It was quite special, and we walked partway around it. The view admittedly never changed much than what you see in this particular picture, but it was still quite fascinating to see.
Mozambique, originally a Portuguese trading post in the 18th century, is situated on the southeastern coast of Africa. We found its capital, Maputo, to be a place of contrasts. From our ship, it presented as a modern, sprawling city. However, walking the port area revealed buildings sadly in need of repair and litter-filled streets, while the suburbs boasted many upscale restaurants and hotels. It was a city of many faces, for sure. It was also wedding day in Maputo. We saw more than half a dozen wedding parties on our walking tour of the highlights of the city, including this one in front of the impressive Parliament building with its imposing statue of the first president of Mozambique. So these wedding parties, the ladies, as you can see, were very elegantly gowned. And there were a couple wedding parties at the train station, which was quite magnificent. And there were little children and very proud of their, their suits and their crinoline dresses, and a couple more wedding parties at the botanical gardens, which seemed to be quite ubiquitous in that part of the world. It was quite interesting. And then we actually even came across a ceremony that was a wedding ceremony taking place in one of the churches we visited, with lovely music accompanying it. And then on to Gary.
And this was our last country, South Africa. And we had 3 ports of call here, Richards Bay, Durban, and Cape Town. So in Richards Bay, we did take an excursion to a game reserve area, safari park, if you like. What was neat about this particular one is that most of the park is inaccessible to people. And so the animals can wander around freely and at will. There's only one small portion where safaris go through and so on. We weren't so sure at one point. Somebody showed up on the road and didn't look like he was going to be ready to share it with us. He did wander off to the right shortly afterwards, fortunately for us. This park was actually called the Shlushluwe Game Reserve, H-L-U-H-L-U-W-E, Shlushluwe. Love that. We saw zebras there as well as impala, wild boars, rhinoceros, and wild dogs as well. After Durban, we were at our final port of call, Cape Town, South Africa. Here you can see the city from Table Mountain, which dominates the skyline of Cape Town. On this particular picture, actually, if you look off to the left-hand side in the water, you will see a small island. That is Robben Island, famous today primarily because that's where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for decades. And we saw his cell when we were on Robben Island. What impressed me about that was there was no plaque, no signs or description or anything else. Ahead of time, when we went into that particular cell block, the guides let us know which cell was Nelson Mandela's, but no markings or trappings beyond that. After the cruise, we did do some extra things in Cape Town. We did take a trip down to the Cape of Good Hope and down to Cape Point. And along the way, we did stop at the Boulders Beach Penguin Colony. So these are Arctic penguins, and there were lots of them. These are only a fraction of the penguins who spend part of the season at the southern tip of Africa. But even on the roadside, we would see things like an ostrich, for example, wandering along. Anyway, that was our 3 months, but we did want to take a few moments as well to tell you just a little bit about what was it like living on the ship for 3 months. So I'll let Jan tell you about that.
The Nautica, our home for 3 months, is small by cruise ship standards, with only about 600 passengers and 400 crew on board, but we were kept busy and well entertained. I usually started the morning on started the morning, especially if it was usually only if it was a sea day, by walking laps around the upper deck overlooking the swimming pool. So the upper deck is the blue that you see at the very top. Our cruise line, Oceania, is not known for its large cabins, but we weren't in ours a lot. Fitness classes, gym workouts, stitching, craft classes, games, and more were all on offer. Lectures about upcoming ports, trivia, daily afternoon tea accompanied by a string quartet, and art scavenger hunts provided lots of opportunity to meet and connect with other passengers. Most evenings, Gary and I attended the shows presented by the very talented and energetic Nautica entertainment team and show band, supplemented by performers flown in for a week or two, and periodically local music and dance troupes. And of course, the food. Oceania might not have large cabins or washrooms, but it has a superb and well-deserved culinary reputation. I'm waiting here for coffee from my favorite barista in the coffee lounge. There were several options for meals. Here's the formal grand dining room where you didn't need a reservation. You simply showed up at whatever time you wanted to eat, and you would ask for a table for two or a sharing table, so you could meet other passengers if you wished. The more casual buffet-style terrace grill for indoor or alfresco eating at the rear of the ship is what you see here. It periodically featured a dinner based on the cuisine of the port that we were visiting. And there were two specialty restaurants which did require a reservation. Here you have the Polo Grill, which served steak and seafood, while the Toscana featured Italian cuisine as well as seafood. Waves Grill was another option for a quick and easy lunch out by the pool. And there was also room service. So we certainly didn't go hungry. There were many aspects of our cruise that made it memorable. One of them was the excellent service provided by the Nautica staff. As two of the 109 passengers who were on board for the full 79 days, we got to know many of the staff and were very well taken care of by people like Maître D. Junie, down on the bottom left, and John in the grand dining room, who served us. Can you see the table in the corner there? John would often serve us at what was called, the hostess called it, our very, very romantic table that she saved specially for us. And our two cabin stewards, Anna from the Ukraine and Superman, were helpful, very helpful, and always cheerful.
And of course, the other thing that occurred on the trip, and especially one of this length, was we had an opportunity to get to know some of the people very well, some of the other passengers, and created some very nice friendships as part of that. Here you see it's actually a family. They were the youngest family on board for the most part, but they had a great time. And they were there for the whole time. They had their two young sons with them. They live on the coast of Florida, so we're a little concerned about yet the second hurricane that is going to beat down on them on the Gulf Coast. But Krista and Rob and their two sons, one in university, Jake, and the other who was taking a few courses on board, Jake, in high school.
Zach.
Yes, Zach. And these are just some of the other people we met. In the top corner, you can see Ruth and Mel. They're from London, England. They were with us on board until Sydney. We got to know them quite well. Susan and Robert at the top right. He is a retired journalist, actually. They're from the US, and that was the couple that Jan met at Raffles. Ray and Jeanette at the bottom left. We did a couple of trips with them as a foursome. One, for example, was in the Maldives, and they're from England as well. And the folks in the bottom left, Chantal and Yves are from Quebec. Great sense of humor. We sort of met up with them in this picture just after the cruise ended in Cape Town, and they had hired a private guide. And they said, well, why don't you just tag along with us? We've got this guide anyway. So we went to Robben Island, actually, and the guide was extremely informative, and we quite enjoyed that. One last slide I'll leave you with. One of the things that never stopped amazing me was to just sit on our balcony. Whoops, sorry, I forgot about this one. We did play trivia, particularly on sea days. We had a team. This was our first team, and this group was with us to Australia. And we figured it was a great team because we had 2 from England, 2 from Australia, 1 from the US, and us from Canada. Some of the 2 folks on the right, Liz and Paul, in fact, were on our team, as was Robert, who is standing beside me. So 5 of us were on the same team for the whole 79 days, and our other players varied as we got on to the next section. So our days with trivia night at Fairlawn served us in good stead. But the last point I wanted to make was just sitting on the balcony and being mesmerized by the water and its colors, but also the sky, and in particular, the clouds. The clouds were just amazing. And these are all shots basically taken from our balcony over the 3 months. And so, Alan, that's it.